Lecture 8, Computing the Future. I've already argued that we should expect any additions of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere to result in global warming. The temperature should go up because of the blocking of outgoing infrared radiation by an enhanced greenhouse effect that goes above and beyond the natural greenhouse warming that's already there of 33 degrees Celsius. But how much should we expect the temperature to go up? That's a more complex question because the climate system is a complicated system. And so our tools for answering the question, what would future climate look like, are climate models, mathematical models that describe as much as we can about the processes that operate in determining Earth's climate. I want to describe those models in this lecture, give you a sense of what they do, how they do it, and in particular why we believe they give us an accurate or semi-accurate picture of what the future brings. I'm not going to say that these models predict the future. These are not like weather predictions. The best we can do in weather predictions, by the way, is about 10 days to 2 weeks out. Beyond that, things get chaotic enough that we simply can't predict the weather in advance. And nobody's attempting to predict the exact climate. What we're trying to do is project the general climatic conditions that we can expect in the future under a variety of scenarios for what we human beings might do in terms of, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, changes in land use, changes in air pollution regulations that might cut down on the amount of aerosols and actually cause more warming because we've reduced that reflection from aerosols. All kinds of possibilities we need to consider. We need to be able to put those into models that allow us to project what might happen under different conditions. So our models become like our laboratories. For climate scientists, climate models are the laboratories in which they do experiments because, as I argued earlier, we can't do real experiments, controlled experiments with Earth's climate. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the climate models we use. First of all, there are a range of climate models, from very simple ones that give you quick answers that may be somewhat accurate in describing a limited amount of what the future climate would look like, to very complex models that incorporate virtually every process we understand. And you might think, well, in this day and age of very fast computers, all we really need to do are these complicated models. But actually, that's not true. It turns out that the whole hierarchy of climate models, from the simplest to the most complicated, is useful in various ways. The simpler ones can elucidate very obvious physics or chemistry or ideas about what is happening in a particular situation, whereas a complex model gets so complex it's like the actual Earth system, and it's a little bit harder to interpret sometimes what it has to tell us. The simpler models can run very rapidly, and therefore you can do many, many experiments with them, whereas I'll soon show you the big complicated models take a very long time to run, even on the fastest computers. So I want to begin describing this hierarchy of models and kind of building them up in complexity. We've actually used climate models already in this course. Early on, I described how you could calculate Earth's temperature in the absence of an atmosphere by simply equating the 240 watts per square meter of sunlight coming in to the known expression, involved the fourth power of the temperature, that tells us the rate at which something that's hot at a given temperature T radiates electromagnetic energy. And that equation alone, equating that outgoing infrared energy as a function of temperature to the incoming 240 watts per square meter of sunlight, that was enough to give us a global average temperature. That was a very simple model. It was a zero-dimensional model. It treated the Earth as just a single point. It didn't distinguish land from water, surface from atmosphere. In fact, it didn't even have an atmosphere. It didn't talk about poles versus equator. It treated the Earth as a single point, but it came up with a not unreasonable answer for the Earth's average temperature. And when we understood the greenhouse effect and took it into account, we could add that to that simple model. We'd sort of be accounting for an atmosphere that way, and we could get a fairly accurate estimate of the Earth's global average temperature, and we could experiment with what would happen if we enhanced the greenhouse effect and saw what the temperature did. So even that simple zero-dimensional model tells us something. Back in lecture 4, I showed you a diagram of all the complicated energy flows between Earth and atmosphere that comprise Earth's climate system. Now, that complicated diagram still didn't take into account variations in latitude and longitude and other aspects of the Earth's surface. It basically treated everywhere on Earth's surface as being the same. But it did take into account the interactions between the Earth and the atmosphere, interactions that are very important in establishing the greenhouse effect, causing reflection, and so on. Well, a very simple, still very simple model for climate is a so-called two-box model, in which you treat the surface as one system, the atmosphere as another system, and you take those various arrows you saw in that diagram. That was a diagram based on observations. It wasn't a model. You take those arrows in those diagrams and you quantify them with equations that describe how much energy is emitted by the surface at a given temperature, how much energy is emitted downward from the atmosphere when it's at a given temperature, and so on. And you would end up sort of redrawing that diagram with two boxes and showing arrows representing, for example, sunlight coming in from outer space, reflected sunlight going back to space, infrared emission from the atmosphere, infrared emission from the surface to the atmosphere, infrared emission from the atmosphere to the surface, convection and evaporation going up from the surface and carrying energy into the atmosphere, sunlight that comes through the atmosphere and carries energy down. You could put arrows in representing all those features that appeared in that diagram of the climate system, and you could then solve simultaneously the equations that describe all those flows in terms of things you know, like the amount of incoming sunlight, 240 watts per square meter, the amount of greenhouse gases, which tells you how much infrared gets absorbed, and so on. And you would come up with that in that two-box model with a temperature for the atmosphere and a temperature for the surface. When I teach my global climate change course at Middlebury College, a kind of intermediate undergraduate level course that requires some mathematics, my students actually build a two-box climate model and they put the equations into a computer, or because this model is simple enough, they actually solve them with pencil and paper, and they get out an atmospheric temperature and a surface temperature. And in this model, where the entire atmosphere is lumped together, one thing they immediately see is the atmosphere has to be cooler than the surface. And they can experiment with changes in the amount of greenhouse gases and changing the numerical quantities represented by that in the model. And they can experiment and look at how the surface temperature and the atmospheric temperature change, for example. So that's a two-box model. And that's a fairly sophisticated, but nevertheless still simple way of looking at the climate system and making some serious projections about what might happen under certain circumstances. When the models get more complex, they tend to include variations with latitude, and they may have many layers of ocean depth or many layers in the atmosphere. And those are called two-dimensional models, models in which things vary in two different directions. In a two-dimensional model, for example, typically you vary in altitude and you vary in latitude, because latitude is far more significant in determining conditions on the surface of the Earth than longitude, because the Earth is basically symmetric around its rotation axis, but it's very unsymmetric from poles to equator and back to poles again. So a two-dimensional climate model is more complicated still. It involves typically variations with latitude and variations with altitude, and you can show in such a model things like the large-scale circulation of the atmosphere, which results from the heating of the surface, typically at the equator, mostly at the equator. Air rises and it forms large cyclic patterns of air movement that, among other things, transport moisture and energy poleward, both toward the North Pole and toward the South Pole. So a two-dimensional climate model can do quite a bit for you in terms of exploring the processes that go on in the climate system. But the more complex models are three-dimensional. They're called global GCMs, which you might think stands for Global Climate Model, and today it often does, but it's an outgrowth of the acronym for Global Circulation Models, because these models looked at the entire globe in three dimensions and attempted to calculate climatic effects, including the circulation of the atmosphere. And how do these models work, these GCMs, these Global Climate Models or general circulation models? Well, what they do is divide Earth's surface and atmosphere and ocean into small regions called cells. And within each of those cells, they calculate the processes that are going on that establish climate. What are those processes? They're typically flows of energy from adjacent cells. Maybe if you have a cell at the bottom layer of the atmosphere, energy is coming up from the surface. Energy is also coming down from the sun. There's infrared energy. You also calculate the movement of material in and out of these cells. Maybe there's an airflow occurring and it's bringing heated air into the region, or maybe there's moist air coming into this region. You calculate the flows of energy and matter, and also momentum, which gives you forces on adjacent cells. You calculate the flows of those fundamental physical quantities into and out of these cells. You do that for all the cells that represent the layers of the atmosphere, the layers of the ocean, the different parts of the Earth's surface, and in very realistic models, you include continents and oceans, you include topography like mountains, and you do an enormous calculation solving many, many, many equations simultaneously, and out of that comes a model climate. And of course, you can alter the model's atmosphere to see what would happen if we put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, what would happen if we stopped greenhouse emissions today, and so on. So these models represent serious attempts to look at the structure of the entire climate system by breaking the Earth, the atmosphere, and the ocean up into many, many tiny cells and calculating what's going on in each of those cells.